Okay, so welcome everybody. We are here for our artist talk, which is part of our 46th annual pottery show and sale this year online. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully you've had a chance to also check out the sales that are going on right now at oldchurchpotteryshow.org. There's a link there to our Shopify account. There will be more work released tomorrow at 10 a.m. So make sure you come back and take a peek. My name is Lisa Beth Fatoso. I am the former executive director of the art school at Old Church, and I've been project managing the pottery show this year. This is a fundraiser for the art school, which is a nonprofit arts and cultural center in Dehnert, New Jersey. We've been around for 46 years, and the show is as old as the school, started by Karen Carnes and Michael Zakin as a means of support for the school, and it's our biggest and most beloved event, and thank you all for your support online this year. I'd like to introduce our curators, Bruce Dehnert, Chris Gustin, and Aysha Peltz, who are all zooming in today from New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Vermont, respectively. And we are talking today with Andrea Gill, Jessica Brandl, Kevin Snipes, and Michael Kline. Thank you all for joining us. So again, if you can just please make sure you are muted and turn your camera off. You can either have it in speaker view, which will highlight who is speaking, or gallery view if you'd like to see everybody at the same time. I'm going to turn it over to Aysha. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks to all of you zooming in. This is a surreal way to gather, but also wonderful and so much fun to see how far-reaching the show and the connection is this year. I'm seeing names come up on the chat scroll from all over the country. So welcome, so nice that you're here. And I'm gonna start with a question that we'll put to the four artists who have agreed to come today, which is so great. We've got Jessica, Michael, Kevin, and Andrea, and thank you so much. So I'll pose the first question. I'm gonna pass it to Jessica, who I haven't met in person yet. So we're meeting through a screen first. And then we'll go through the other artists. So the question has to do with the reality of this year. The last 8 months have been incredibly challenging for many of us. We have a global pandemic, newly galvanized race awareness and activism, and a lot of political upheaval. How has your studio life changed during this time? How has your work changed? For some of us, our work draws literally from current events through illustration, for others more abstractly, and for most of us, it might be subtler or not demonstrated through the work. Have any of these current events, this 2020 world we're in, affected the pots that you're making? And that's a bit of a mouthful with many layers, but I'm gonna ask Jessica to respond and share with us thoughts on that.
Well, it's a pleasure to meet you too, and to see everybody's faces. I have felt pretty stir crazy since everything has closed up and closed down for the most part. Studio and life and work have to go on, of course. I actually was in the midst of teaching at a temporary job in Kansas City when the shutdown started to happen in around April, I think, for Kansas City. And so I was really fearful that I wasn't going to be able to make it back to Montana, where I've been living for the past 2.5 years. As an artist in residence at the Archie Bray Foundation. During that time, you know, I kind of, like everyone else, hit the deck and then kind of figured out a way to pick up the pieces beyond that. And so I got back here to Montana, recognized that I was out of time for the Bray because I had to move out of that during all of this shutdown, which was in July, end of July. And on top of that, a lot of my aspirations for 1 year and beyond teaching appointments were completely shelved. All of those were instantaneously canceled. So, you know, I kind of had to really regroup and understand how making was important to me and what I was going to do about it. So with that being said, I actually, I had been saving since 2013 after my nomadic life began, because I had a kind of sedentary, quiet, not very visual pottery life then. And so I took that nest egg and decided to do what I could with it in Helena, Montana. And so I purchased a house, not because I wanted the house, but because I wanted the detached garage. And since June, I've been tooling up and making a place to work. And since I can very nearly see the Archie Bray Foundation from the house, that's not a coincidence, I have been dragging my work down there to fire it until I can get an electrician to tool up my studio for the kilns that I have. So I think more than anything, back to what it's done to the work, is it's about feeling. I think some of it's been grieving, like kind of private and tucked in. The things that I thought that I wanted are not possible, but I'm not one to just kind of curl up and go to sleep. I have to make sense of the world by making. And so I did that by, doing, essentially stretching all of my resources to the max to make buy a physical studio space and work there. So, anything will do.
That's great. Great. Congratulations on your new plan.
Thank you. I just kind of went on. I think I've lost my social skills quite a bit because I haven't really been around other humans other than a very small circle, which is both safe, but it seems as though public speaking is a skill.
Well, you did great, and thank you for those for that. Let's bat it down. I guess we're going to Andrea next. Thanks, Jessica. Same question, and I can remind you of it if you'd like.
No, I could just go because I wrote down answers, which I'm not going to use. But anyway, first of all, I just want to say hi to Jessica and how amazing it must be to be a young artist who isn't settled with a studio in the backyard and everything ready to go and my clay made and absolutely no reason to not get to work except my granddaughter came to live with me, was now 2 years old this week. So there was a slight interruption because I was babysitting while my daughter and her husband worked. But other than that, I would say what happened in my studio was I became much more involved in what you might call a meditative point of view, really trusting my work and trusting what I wanted to do more. But I basically have such a lucky life here. There were no problems that I had to solve other than getting into the studio. And I also started listening to Audible books, which I'd never done before. And my daughter sent me, of all books, White Fragility, which I ended up listening to 2 or 3 times while I was working, which made me really think about everything differently. But as far as the work is concerned, I think my work has always been sort of about trying to find a sense of joy and peace in the world. And the pots are really just trying to do that. And hopefully that will continue to add something to somebody's life who gets one of my pieces, whether it's COVID or not. But that's basically where I've been this past, 8-10 months since we had to go under.
That's great. And nice to have a little body in the house. A two-year-old, you said, enlivens and refocuses energies, right? You have to help with the reality of a 2-year-old that puts you in a really sort of core place. And Audible books are also a great way to educate, listen, and still work with your hands and process in different ways. So thanks, Andrea.
Thank you.
Let's move on to Kevin. Hi, Kevin, down in Florida.
Not Florida, I'm in Philadelphia.
You're in Philadelphia, that's right, of course.
Well, like Jessica, I've been sort of a nomad in my career. And in the spring, I was actually living in Macon, Georgia. And I was finishing up a residency at a small college. So I had to move out of my campus apartment and my studio in June. And I had decided, interestingly enough, that I wanted to move to Philadelphia to kind of settle for a while, at least a few years. And a lot of that had to do with this whole social unrest that we're in. But it was before, my decision was actually last year. I decided that I wanted to be around more diverse people. Like it's been sort of an ongoing experience for me of kind of being the one of the very few Black people in my environment. And so I thought maybe I could meet more Black people in Philadelphia. So I applied to be a resident artist at the Clay Studio. And, you know, in some ways, you know, like I should be at a place where I'm not doing a residency necessarily, but I should be having kind of hunkering down and getting in a studio. But, you know, there's a lot of transition for me. And I just, you know, like moving to Philly is a huge move in the middle of a pandemic. And so, you know, I've actually, since June, I moved my studio twice or 3 times, and I've moved my home 4 times. So it's been a lot of shuffling around, and that's been really rough. You know, so I feel like I'm not even sure what my work is doing right now. The work that I have in the show is work that actually I made in the spring, and I just got around to glazing it. So it's been really disruptive. But
I bet that's a lot of moving.
yeah, I'm really interested in, you know, what's going to happen next year. And I don't know with my work, you know, like really trying to, like, this is what I was thinking last year. It's like, personally, I love nature, and I love being someplace like North Carolina. And so I was thinking maybe I should move to North Carolina. But I think my work loves this urban, kind of vibrant multiculturalness. And so my work is like my child. So I was trying to figure out the right place for my child to live. And so it's like, okay, well, even though I like living in places like North Carolina, my work really thrives in places like Philadelphia. So, and this was all thinking before the pandemic was even a thing, or the social unrest was a thing. So it's, in some ways, it's kind of, there's some synchronicity to it, which is just weird.
Yeah. In some ways, it's like Jessica. It's pushed you into making a decision, right? There was a sort of moment of having to shift and make a fast decision because we were in this very strange time.
Well, I mean, the decision came before the time, and so that's why I'm saying it's kind of like just weird that, you know, it's, in some ways, it's kind of what I asked for, but just not the way I asked for it.
Right.
I really wanted to be part of a more diverse cultural experience, but I wasn't expecting it to be riots and, you know, like.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, welcome to Philly. I'm sure they're so thrilled that you're there, and the Clay Studio is a great place to land when you have to move 4 times, and at least you can have a solid base. And I'm so impressed that you got all that work blazed and fired for this show, and thank you so much for doing it. I'm sure you're doing it for other places as well, but
no, this is it.
And I love that my work is my child, and I'm taking care of them right now. That's what I wrote down. So thanks, Kevin. I'm glad you're in Philly, not Florida. Hi, Michael.
Hi, everybody.
Same question to you.
What was the question? No, just kidding. I guess I'm looking at your question saying how these events affected me, and I have to think back. It seems like a million years ago, when I was teaching a workshop, and in the midst of that workshop, we were joking about washing our hands and no high fives and that kind of thing. And before we left the workshop, it was a 5-day workshop, and SECA had been canceled, the NBA had been canceled, all this stuff started happening. So I think for me, that kind of cascading series of events continued when I came home, and we didn't know what to expect. So at the time I had an apprentice, and I decided we would just have to close our circle tighter. And I bought some chickens, and, you know, we were going to become homesteaders and live off the land, which we have here. But I think one of the main things I remember in the studio, I didn't work for a while. I just stopped working, and we walked a lot, and I didn't have the bandwidth in a way to work in the studio. But after a while I got really antsy and began to work. But I do remember that early sort of psychic mental bandwidth of just being free to do whatever. And I felt like we had some sense of security. My wife has a job at Penland School, so we felt we were going to be okay. But the reality was I really like to make things, and when I'm stressed or when I'm anxious, I work, and so I work a lot. And I got back to work, and what was interesting was that I found I was fairly successful at selling my work online, and that was has driven me since. And I've been able to work pretty steadily, almost as busy as I had ever been. One of the things I've noticed, though, is that the turmoil and the chaos of the last few months found that I haven't been taking as many risks in the studio. I feel like and that may be something that may be a factor of selling online and supplying the shop, so to speak. But I don't know if I felt comfortable to address those issues. I was actually coming to the studio to forget in a way and kind of get lost in my work. At the same time, I feel like my work, the work that I am most challenged by, I didn't approach either. I was kind of making what I was familiar with. And that's been a good thing. I mean, as a studio potter, it's great to fill up a table full of pots that I have no doubts about. Or no questions, really. No head scratching or questions. I felt very comfortable doing that, but I feel almost like a little bit of guilt too, that my life hasn't changed a whole lot. I continue to make pots, and I feel like there's a lot of people who aren't in the same position as me and don't have the same freedoms as a small business owner maybe, or an artist. So I feel a little bit of I'm not too exuberant to brag about that. And I don't want to brag about that too much, because I know there's a lot of people who are hurting right now. But it has been a fairly steady year. I miss the students from Penland School coming to visit, miss my customers who come to visit, but I've been fairly steady and happy in the studio working on my pots.
That's great. I think what you're pointing to, the comfort in your studio and the comfort in the work that doesn't challenge you as much, I think is a really interesting observation. And I would say there's something that that's happened similarly in my studio. That there's that going to our studio is a place, I think for most of us, that's a solace. So thank you. Thanks for sharing. And
there's some artists, I read an article years ago about Komar and Malamud had done a survey of what art people like. And I remember thinking about that during economic boom, artists or people gravitate towards representational art, but in times of trouble, they look more towards abstraction. I'm not sure if that's has anything to do with what we're talking about here, but I think there is that relationship with our culture, our society, and I think what you're asking is more specific about what the artist is doing and how they're reacting. Anyway.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to keep it moving, but we might have to come back to that one. That's a good one. Bruce, are you next in line? No, who's going next? Bruce? Yes. I'm going to introduce Bruce again.
I am next.
You are next.
I am next. Geez, that we could have stayed on that question, that topic for the entire time. That was super interesting. So last night, Aysha, you inspired me because you brought one of Karen's pots with you and showed on the presentation last night. So I brought Jeff Kleckner tonight. So Jeff showed at the Old Church Pottery Show a number of times, and Jeff, for those of you who don't know, just recently passed away. So I grabbed this guy because this is one of my favorite pieces in our collection.
I'm so glad you brought that. Thanks, Bruce. Yeah, it's lovely.
Really great. I wish everybody out there in the audience could feel this because it's just pretty amazing. So before I ask my question, it's going to go to Andrea to start off with. And this question I wrote kind of for Andrea because of my graduate experience with her, but I know that it applies to everybody, all artists, whether they're working in clay. It doesn't matter the medium and so forth. So, but we'll start with Andrea on this one, and I'm just going to minimize here. And it has to do with how we edit ideas, what ideas we start off with, because of course, I'm assuming that everybody has more ideas than they can possibly deal with. And so making art is so much about making choices. Successful artists are smart, multifaceted thinkers. So there tend to be many ideas coming and going all the time, with some landing and being chosen and others being put over there in the waiting room. With the limited time we have as artists, we can't get to everything. So what does your editing process look like? How do you choose which ideas to pursue?
Thanks, Bruce. I knew this was going to happen, that the roles were going to be switched and I was going to be the graduate student answering some difficult question and trying to sound not too stupid about it. But I guess I've decided to take what you might call an incredibly embarrassingly honest point of view about how I make my work, which is that I just find something. And I guess I wrote down this thing that it's just a thing or a book that I see. And sometimes a book actually hits me on the head. One of the last series I did was based on a book that Akio Takamori had given me in 1978 and I'd never looked at. And after he passed away, I just pulled it off the shelf because I was missing him. But what happens is I will find this source and then I kind of appropriate everything I can possibly appropriate from that source, to the point where I actually do a lot of tracing and copying from whatever that source is. And then I go to my printer and my copier and copy my drawings and then blow them up and shrink them and cut them in half and paste them back together. So by the time I get ready to make something, it's really probably more mine than it is my source. So my sources change all the time. This body of work that I'm making right now, the birds all came from a picture that was in a book about Maiolica. And the original picture was about 1/4 of an inch high. So you could see I steal stuff from everywhere. And the big problem I have is that I do this sourcing both for the image and the object, actually quite separately. So I go through this horrible process twice of like digging into something. But it could be even an image. A lot of my work was a while ago was based on an image that was on a Chinese plate that had a picture of a basket of flowers on it. And I turned that into this entire series of ridiculous pieces because they were made out of a vase and a basin. And they were really hard to sell and make because they were just impossibly difficult. But I honestly don't think I ever have any ideas. I just have to steal them. Sorry, that's the truth.
Wow. Well, you know, what's interesting about that is you used I really picked up on the word horrible.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. When you were talking earlier.
Sorry about that.
It's just quite amazing when I look at your work, whether it's the vase work with the you know, the emphasis on the pattern motifs and all those transitions. You guys were talking about transitions. Every single one of you on the previous question talked about transition, and so that was blasting through my mind. And when I think about your work, there's so much about transition, and how could that possibly be horrible? And then these pieces that you have in the show this year are just like, God, they're so fantastic, you know. Anyway, okay, so let's go with.
Not so horrible. I will mute myself now.
I love that. Michael, you want to take a stab at it? And Michael, you're muted.
There we go. Okay, sorry,
There we go.
Mouse problems. Wow, that's an interesting question. I think that my editing happens sort of session to session in the studio. It's I get into these real granular, silly little things like what's in my wadding, or what's, you know, real kind of monotonous, boring kind of stuff. But it's almost like I focus on that, and then I think the process of working in the studio and going from clay to decorating, there's so much that can happen that's I'm not really, I'm not sure if this has anything to do with editing. I need an editor. But I think that my influences or my decisions where I go are based on what I really liked in the previous firing, what's working, and I'm always surprised at how my intentions never end up where I think they will be, end up in the firing. So that kind of propels me into the next firing cycle, next session. I do get things off the internet. I look at work on the internet and I get influenced that way. But I feel like I'm very slow to change. And that pace of firing to firing is really what propels me, I guess.
Wow, when I think of your work over the last 15 years, that's really interesting that you say that you're slow to change.
Right.
There are these periods of time, and there are these points in time, not periods, but points in time in which all of a sudden it's like Shazam, and and it usually has something to do with layering. I find that. Yeah. And it just keeps getting deeper and deeper and deeper, in terms of layering with you.
I agree. I think my own perception is very different from what other people perceive. I guess what I'm perceiving is I'm looking at things that are really subtle, I guess, and not as obvious to me or anybody else. Thanks, appreciate that.
Great, thanks, Michael. Jessica, shall we go with you, and then we'll follow up with Kevin.
Yeah, thank you. It felt good not to go first. I'm always deer in the headlights. I don't even remember what we said when you introduced me and the question.
Well, every deer that I've ever hit was the third deer.
I hope that's a good thing for me. When it comes to my references, what I draw into studio, things like that, I think my backdrop is a good metaphor. I'm looking out. I want to be out and moving in between that space of forever sky and forever earth and make sense of it all. So to simplify, it's kind of like being a ceramic cultural anthropologist. I'm mining everything, every potential object as a meaning maker for me. And then to bring it back into a space that relates to kind of the everyday American and what's relevant to them, and try and build a relationship of my out there ethereal brain with folks that, like you said, Michael, that are really folks that are struggling a lot right now, and be honest and considerate of the struggles that people in lower class or poor environments are struggling to understand how to make sense of the world. So I think I will always make from that place that is me trying to understand my own personal feelings, but I encode it in the objects that I use. The feel of an object can be excited and happy, or it can be sinister and a little bit barbed. And I think that comes down to the feeling that I have at that moment while I'm making it. Whether I intend it to be a happy piece or a somber or sad piece is not always up to me. I think that some of those characteristics that come through are just a clay doing what it does best, recording mark, and that mark is influenced by feeling. As far as editing down, I seem to really revolve around a lot of garbage. I've reflected on that a lot of times. It's like, why is it? And it's because like when I'm walking in a space, whether it's like vastly wild and seems like there's no people, or whether it's like living in really metropolitan areas, I'm curious at what people just kind of get used to seeing as, you know, litter or things on the ground, and then understand and try to understand the people that was used by. And framing that, reframing garbage into a work of art takes a stretch, because that's not what we consider beautiful typically. Those are usually the elements of unbeautification. And I stick with them because they bug me. And it was while studying art history and having these like visceral, like repulsive feelings about certain artists' work, that I realized that those artists, even though they had irritated me, had actually affected me very deeply, because their use or their compositions drew me in a way that made me question the world. And so I think that I operate from that kind of same baseline principle. Is I want something beautiful, yes, but I also want something to make you ask what or how, and see what it does to you. It's kind of like your own little collage that can be almost like a Rorschach, where one person will see something very positive, and then the next person next to them may see something completely different, which is always my goal. So I think
Well, I was thinking about the background that you've chosen to put behind you, and thinking about how that's so diametrically opposed to what I'm used to in your motifs or your storytelling on your work.
Yeah.
So I find that really interesting, and you kind of you pretty much answered my follow-up question, which was going to be about that.
Keep going from that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, Kevin, how about you? Do you remember the question all right?
Kinda. I would say that my work is a collision of obsessions. So I'm often thinking about, I get ideas, they come to me, and I'm like, wow, that's a good idea. That's really interesting. And I'll, you know, for instance, in graduate school, I was just really interested in this idea of dynamic forms. And I was trying to think, okay, what's the dynamic forms in ceramics specifically? So I was thinking, okay, whose work do I know who's really dynamic? And I was thinking, Chris Gustin, he makes really dynamic work. And so I wasn't really interested in making Chris's work, but I was really interested in how Chris approached making dynamic work. And that became sort of this obsessive thing, just trying to figure out how to approach making ceramic forms that are dynamic. But, you know, like my work is, you know, like I said, a collision of obsessions. So there's also, you know, imagery, there's, you know, right now I've been drawing lots of like YouTube symbols and like iPhones and things like that. And just trying to think about how social media is affecting all of us. And, you know, so my work is, you know, like, I feel really grateful for my sketchbook, which I always have with me. That, you know, like ideas go in here, and sometimes I forget about them, but then I can refer to them like a year or 2 or 3 later, or next week or something. And so I'm just sort of cycling through things. You know, I think about color. I look at textiles, for instance. You know, like there's some really beautiful rugs that I walked past on my way to the studio. I'm like, wow, those are really great colors. So I take pictures and I think about how I can kind of incorporate those. So, you know, there's not really any planned action. I think it's just a lovely thing to be able to kind of just collect and collect and collect, and then sort of filter out through my artist hands and eyes. So it's always changing and always kind of, you know, like what's next. At the same time, trying to maintain sort of like, you know, like I've always wanted to work in series, but it's really hard for me to do that. So I do a lot of jumping around, but that's all right.
That's interesting. Yeah. I love the fact that you are, every single one of you talked about the sources from which you choose, and where you go to do that. And the real trick, of course, here is that every single one of you end up with something that feels very fresh and something that I haven't ever seen before. Yeah. Yeah, and yet you have all referred to looking at other things and borrowing, and in Andrea's case, she used the word stealing.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's really nothing new in the world. I think it's all kind of a remix. It doesn't matter if you're a filmmaker or a musician. Like I think that hip hop music really, that's all about sampling and and making something new from old work.
Yeah.
And we can only make work from our experiences. I mean, they could be dreams. I actually had this experience last year where I was looking across the studio at a collection of out of focus objects on someone else's shelf. It was one of those, actually there was a red and a blue of those plastic cups that people use for glaze test often. Those, what are those called? Those, whatever they're out. They're
Solo cups.
Solo cups.
Yeah.
There was those 2 solo cups, and there was also a plastic like soup container, like a potato salad container. And there was also some papers. It's just like a pile of junk. And I was looking at it, and I saw in that pile of junk across the room in a blurred vision, this image of this piece that I wanted to make. And so I squinted my eyes so I could really lock it down. And I kind of got it, and then I made this piece, and it was really great. And it was really different.
Oh, that's really interesting. I can totally see that in the work. Do you know
Yeah.
bokeh? You know bokeh effect? You're kind of doing bokeh effect with
yeah.
Batgirl. Yeah, your Batgirls are reminding me a little bit of bokeh effect. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody, and we'll turn it over to Chris next.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? I want to make sure my mic's all hooked in here.
Yep.
Okay. Well, this is an interesting discussion that we're all having here, and I'm loving hearing how each of you are approaching things from sometimes similar and sometimes very different points of view. And we're in this time, the COVID times, as we kind of refer to it in our little pod here in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. And the show that we're doing at Dehnert is a show that is based on bringing potters together, who the curators, for whatever our histories are, our biases, our choices, we sit in a room and we figure it out, and we put these 30 people together to come out to New Jersey and show their work and to sell their work. And this is a paradigm of how one way that as a maker you can put your work out into the world. We make things, we make objects, and in many ways it's a social contract. It is, if we're just making them for ourselves, I used to do that when I was a younger potter. I'd give everything to my parents, and then you'd give them to your friends, and then you sell a few pieces, and your door opens into a much larger world of how your work may live outside of self. And over the last, 5 years, something like that, it seems like there's been a paradigm shift, especially, I came up in the 80s, 70s and 80s, and the way you put your work out in the world was kind of defined through the system that you came up in. So if you came up as an apprentice, it was more of a studio potter system, which had to do with, opening your own studio, selling out of your studio, maybe doing fairs. If you went to the university, came up through an art school thing, it became more of a gallery system. And so your aspirations either led you one way or the other. And I'm interested in how the last few years have started to really rattle that paradigm. I mean, it's really shifted it, and it's screwed up a lot of people in terms of rethinking how do you actually put your work in the world, and for the show that we're doing right now, we really had to think this through and how to get all of your work out there so people could see it and buy it, and so you could make some money selling stuff so you can keep making stuff, you know, and there's that kind of, you know, thing we never really talk about, but, you know, how do you get your work out there? So I'm interested in hearing from each of you about kind of maybe the choices you're having to make or having to shift, you know, the ideas that have to shift from getting your work from your hands and from your studio into somebody else's, and is it a problem? Is it not a problem? How do you see the future? What decisions and choices you're making to kind of move forward in that? So maybe we could start with Michael on that one and see where we go.
Oh yeah, really interesting thinking. I think any time is made up of what's happened and what's the hope for the future, right? Any place we find ourselves in, we're always thinking about our successes or our failures and how we can improve and how we can go forward. I think I've been thinking a lot about how I've felt fairly diversified as far as how I found success, as far as making pottery, teaching workshops, and what else is, you know, and having a social media kind of a presence, I guess. I feel like that all helped me to be successful this year. But I feel like if I speculated about the future, I think we won't go back to what we had before. I think a lot of friends of mine, potter friends and artists, have realized that there's a huge market online if you want to sell your work. I think what you sell and how you sell it is just a matter of design. But I think that I feel like there's probably not going to be this, even at Penland, I think teaching workshops is going to be very different, at least for the next year or two. I think we've changed as people. I think somebody, maybe Jessica mentioned earlier, she hasn't seen very many people, and I haven't either, and except for my family. And I think socially we probably regressed a little bit, and I may not feel comfortable in a craft show right now. I may like say stay back, or I'm not sure how this is going to work. I'm really anxious about that. I'm hopeful. I look forward to seeing people, but I think it's going to take a while to unravel or ravel back up what's unraveled in the last year. I feel like, though, that I do want to, I feel like I'm optimistic. I feel like what I do miss the most is the interaction with students in workshops, people visiting my studio. I really feel like that's an important part of my making, is the interactions with folks, whether they use my pots or not, or whether they're potters, or whether they're new to looking at pottery. So I feel like that's still something I think it's valuable. I miss it terribly. But I feel like it may be a stretch to think we're going to go back to the 10x10 booth in a craft show, you know, or a festival. I'm sure some shows may survive. I think business-wise, I think a lot of these producers of craft shows have been hurt hard, you know, pretty badly this last summer, fall. But I feel like I'm optimistic, and I think the technology is here for us to use, and I'm looking forward to learning how to use it to teach workshops, I guess. If I'm really desperate, it's nice to be able to be in touch with folks and pass it on, you know. It's hard to do that on a screen, I think, but I'm looking forward to getting back to some normality. I mean, we all must be feeling that. I'm not sure what that will be. Oops, I can't hear you, Chris. Uh-oh.
Chris is he's in the middle of a nor'easter in Massachusetts, and they don't have power. So he's rigged up a generator, and he's using his phone to do this. So is it okay, Bruce? I'm going to take the reins and just pass this to the next person. Same question. I'm not sure who was next in line, but let's Let's go to Jessica. No, did you just do it? You just did it. We did Jessica. No. That was the last one. Jessica, same question.
Okay. Yeah, it's just the second person, so it's me. I feel like I dipped my toes into craft markets. My first ever craft fair was Smithsonian Craft Show, and I met a lot of older crafters that said that it's like on this weird downward trajectory, and it didn't fit. Like, it didn't make sense to me, but yet I really enjoy work that is more or less curated within my own social medias. I get the feedback. I'm naughty. I oftentimes enjoy the process of making it and having feedback and correspondence with viewers more so than the finished object, which is strange because I do participate in some craft shows, but more or less when I build up work, I eventually just have a studio sale through either my own social media or Etsy shop and sell through it so that I can just make work again. And it's strange to me because when I lay it out, because we're supposed to be small businesses, it seems really haphazard, but it still seems to balance out, which is a strange feeling, right? You're not having the FaceTime, you're not like soliciting galleries, but yet by pursuing and setting up your own markets, you do as well, if not better. And I think it's true. Like, galleries have been a good thing in promoting in the past, but they're not. They include a lot of extra cost, is what I've found. And if I want to continue to be a slow maker, my relationships with galleries or showing spaces is primarily based around if I have to ship things or not, which sounds kind of selfish, but it's really down to me protecting the way I like to make and the pace I like to make it at.
I think we've lost Chris again. That's great.
Bummer.
We'll just keep the ball rolling. I know Chris would like to be here, and I think he's frantically trying to figure it out. So Kevin, do you want to chime in on how have sales shifted for you or work for you?
Well, I think agreeing with Jessica, I think, the great thing about having a gallery is that they do a lot of promotion, but, in recent years, with social media, you can see lots of really young artists doing a great job at, selling online. And so things are shifting, and they are going to stay shifted. They're not going to necessarily go back. So there's going to be a change, especially after the pandemic, that's really come to a head of online sales. But I haven't gotten there yet. I'm not, I don't, that's the least favorite part of my job is the business part. So I'm really not that excited about being my own business person. But, I'll have to change. Hey, Chris. We are continuing on.
I hate this. I'm in the middle of a nor'easter, so it's like all my power's out. It's like internet's not working. It's the nightmare.
So a friend of mine told me about this woman, I think in California, who's making basically like bongs and pipes and making a killing. She's got 400,000 followers, and she just is constantly selling out. And she's probably taken a few workshops or learned on YouTube or something, and she's got this great business from this new way of living. And I appreciate that. So I don't know how how I'm going to find myself in this new world that we live in. I just maybe I have to become just a better business person or hire someone else to do that for me. That's
I think it's interesting. I cut out when Michael was talking, and I just caught a little bit of what Jessica was saying, and what you're saying. The idea of how we go into our studios and we work, and we're talking about ideas and kind of how we approach ideas in our work, and we had systems to put those ideas out into the world, and as those systems change, it like what you're all talking about is how you know, the community or the viewership, if you will, of those receiving your work. So, you know, how do the pots themselves, how do the decisions change in this new kind of paradigm we're in? You know, Michael talked a little bit earlier, I think, with Bruce about that. You know, like, are you taking as many risks, or are you gearing towards a more specific market now because of that shift? And is there a struggle in that, or is there not? You know, I mean, these are things that we all have to kind of confront. And I just think it's an interesting moment in that. And we tend not to talk about that very much, you know.
I think it's like the shift from horses to automobiles in some ways. It's a big shift.
Yeah. And it's happening really quick,
Mm-hmm.
as did that.
Yeah.
That was actually a fascinating moment in history.
Yeah.
It took 7 years.
7
to go
years.
from 7 years to go from complete horseback riding to cars. Think of that in terms of transportation, the shift in that. It's like light speed.
So Andrea, what do you
So
think?
Andrea.
Unmute. Well, it's very different talking about the future when you're my age.
Andrea, no.
Yes, and because Chris was my roommate in undergraduate school, he might be having these same thoughts. But the truth is, it's just, you know, a couple of basic facts. I was a teacher. I spent a lot of my life in academia. And so my making, after we left Kent, Ohio, and I took a teaching job, really went into the back seat compared to people like Michael Kline, who has just really been able to be a potter. And Chris, you know, you left academia and you've always been my hero when it comes to business. You seem to have it all figured out no matter what you're doing.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and I've just really enjoyed seeing your success in that. In my case, I came on the scene just as the gallery world came on the scene. In other words, I had my first show in a gallery in New York because it was the first show in the gallery that the gallery had. So I grew up in that system, and that system is, like a lot of people are saying, especially for the craft world, is pretty much drying up. But I've never made a lot of work. And so I've always just been very lucky that there's always been an opportunity. And right now, you know, Sam Harvey still has a very good gallery that's very good at you know, having great artists, and also he can sell the work. He's the only place I'm selling my work now. So I sort of think of him as my mentor. You know, I make my work for him, you know, and I'm hoping he's going to like it. And if he likes it, then that's good. And if he can sell it, that's even better. But as far as like this whole new world, the only thing I would say about that is this whole new world I'm in, which is why I'm in this show, I think, is my slipcast work that I started making for my daughter's wedding. And it was totally not about selling the work at all. And then Lisa Orr asked me to be in a show in Texas. Like, oh boy, I better make some more of that stuff. And then Chris and Bruce and Aysha asked me to be a Dehnert. I thought, oh my goodness, better make some more of that stuff. So, and every time I go back into the studio and remake it, I sort of come to it with a slightly different point of view or idea. So I really have to thank you guys for asking me to be in this, because otherwise I probably would have just, you know, cooked a lot more cookies or something, you know.
You know, I think that's really beautiful that you made pots for your daughter's wedding, and they're kind of one-offs. You know, it's just like, you know, you wanted to do something really wonderful for her, so you gave of yourself to do that, and to give to the community of people who came to the wedding.
Right.
And out of that kind of generosity, a door has opened for whatever reasons, to give that, to have that work accessible to others, I guess. You know, I think both of you and I both have a struggle on some level, is because, you know, when our bigger work sells for a lot of money, so it's how do you reach a larger audience, and you do it through the smaller work, and in terms of accessibility, you know, an ownership and where people can have things. And the slipcast work is that door in for you. And I just find that it comes from a happy accident is beautiful. It's not from an intentional thing, but you had to know, you had to like you had to be open to it, because you could very well have not, you know, Lisa Orr called you and you could have said, "No, I don't have anything."
Well, I
You know?
didn't. I had to make it. Luckily, she called me in time.
Yeah. So, but
I just
what I'm
wanted to
getting
say-
at is you had to be open to it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's happening now, is that we all having to be open to these new possibilities and not close doors that we might have closed 5 years ago, saying, "Oh no, that's not the appropriate spot for my work." And I think that's interesting, because it raises more, it asks questions amongst viewership. More people get to see the work in a different context, and I think it's just better for the field.
But I do want to say that I think that that three-dimensional objects are always better seen in person, and I think the beautiful thing about the Dehnert show is that, you know, you get to actually see the work, you know, talk to the artists, you know, feel the work. And I don't like buying pots online, you know. I like buying them in person.
Yeah,
So
and I think it's, you know, we're all being, you know, there's becoming kind of an Instagram type of pottery, you know, and some work translates really well in an image. Work that has a very strong edge to it, that has a dynamic kind of contrast, whether it's through decoration or whatever. And other work, you just can't tell at all.
That's right.
You know.
Yeah, I think that's back to the abstraction versus figurative or graphic nature of work.
Yeah, and I thought that was an interesting comment you made. You know, so that's another struggle that we all have to deal with.
You know, I'll buy one of Michael's pots online because I've seen them in person and I felt them. I know how thick they are. I know what they feel like. But you know, a lot of artists who work I don't know, I kind of don't trust how it's going to function as a functional piece of pottery.
Yeah, and I got to say, Michael, you posted something online the other day that I thought was one of the best pieces I've seen in years of anybody. It was really a beautiful bowl. The decoration on it, it was powerful.
Thank you.
So.
I think there's one thing I'm thinking of that there may be a couple things real quick. I know we're getting close on time. I think maybe for us, our generation or our generations, if we want to collect them all together, aren't as relevant as the younger generation coming up. They're coming up through the internet, and it may be not important to them to hold it. They might look forward to the surprise of not knowing what it may weigh or feel like, and when they receive it in the mail in a box. It's a very different time, I think. And also, I think there's benefits of, for me, photographing work and having that record of my work that I wouldn't have never done 20 years ago, taking pictures of everything I make. But there are some glazes that just don't photograph well, which I really want to make. Anyway, that was just a couple things I wanted to say real quick.
Okay, well, I'm not sure how we're doing on time here.
Yeah, we're just about at an hour. So I'm sure people would not mind if we went on and on with our conversation, but I think Aysha is going to give us our last question before we start to wrap up.
Okay.
Yeah, so many things are percolating. I love this. I think we could stay here all night. I think that the handling of pots is what's missing this year. And I think that part of what's working, the Old Church show, is 46 years of established selling, people coming, people talking to all of us, people holding those pots, people knowing what they're looking at, learning about them. In some ways, I feel like that's what I've been doing in my house more deeply than I have in a long time, because the world has shrunk so much in the last 9 months. My family and I have been living with the work that's been on the walls and in the cabinets for years, but we've pulled it out a lot more frequently, and we've constructed meals around it. We've talked about it. We've shared stories or remembered stories that we've shared with the girls. So there's been a much deeper appreciation those pots through the food that we're serving in them, through the meals that we're making in them. And so the question that I'm going to pose next, and I think that we'll let's go Andrea first in this case, and then we'll shift it down the line, has to do with the vessel. The Pottery Show is a show about pottery. So everybody that we invite has to make something that is a vessel. And when we sit down to select that group, you've heard us talk about the breadth and makers using various techniques and styles and coming from different sort of places in their conceptual work. But it really comes from a history of food in preparation, food storage, food preparation, food service. And so I'm wondering, in this group of 4 artists, and I'd love to ask all 31 artists, can you talk a little bit about your relationship to food? Whether it's feeding the ideas in your studio, Andrea, maybe it's the first making of this new work was for your daughter's wedding, and then you had to think about maybe it was for flower arrangements. I'm not sure, but there was some use that was inspiring it, and I'm curious to hear whether that's feeding the forms that you're making. Or if something that you're doing in the kitchen or the garden is affecting how the work is being made. And we'll start with Andrea, and then we'll kick it around. And it looks like we've lost Michael, but we'll maybe get him back. So.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I've really had to think about it a lot because I realized I don't think I've ever made anything that anybody could actually put food in. I have, and one of the things with this slipcast work and why I started making this slipcast work is I reinvented my glazes and clay bodies so they were much sturdier. I mean, my Maiolica work that I did in grad school is just really, it's full of everything I ever made, crazed. And I have to report to you and everybody who bought one of my cups, you can put it in the dishwasher and it will not craze. Because I've taken one and put it through the dishwasher many times. So I've made the work potentially much more functional than it's ever been. But on the other hand, when I did the work for my daughter's wedding, it ended up all being in the center of the table. And we actually grew all the flowers for the wedding, which was an insane project for 150 people. And then everybody got to take one of the pieces home from the center of the table. That was sort of the idea. So I made a series of about, 10 pieces so that people could fight over them at each table, and then made them for, 15 tables. So it was really the centerpiece and not cups and plates. But anybody who's been to our house knows that our house is just pottery central and that we use everything. I mean, last night we had meatballs in one of Shoko's long trays. Like, why would people put meatballs in a long tray, except we have this beautiful thing that we celebrate our food with all the time. And we entertain a lot. So pottery is just absolutely central to our life. But it's only been recently that I've ever given food a minute's chance. The little pictures that I made that are in the show, they started in a restaurant in Bismarck, North Dakota, when I was driving to the Archie Bray Foundation and was trying to think of what to make. And I made a drawing of a little picture that I said, this is for maple syrup. And because it was October, I figured I could get these done by maple syrup season in March. And it took me about 3 years to get that first picture made. But then they ended up getting flowers in them, and they work great for flowers. I'm not sure if they're going to work for maple syrup. Have to wait for the next season, see how they work.
Thanks. I love the giving that came with the making of the work for your daughter. And your house is a fabulous house to visit and eat food in, because the pots are just remarkable. Thank you, Andrea. How about Kevin? Kevin, can you talk a little bit about how food has fed the forms that you're making or the work that you're making, if at all?
I love eating food. But I would say that when I moved to Philadelphia, I realized that all of my kitchen stuff, or almost all my kitchen stuff, is in my sister's basement in Cleveland. And because of COVID, I didn't really want to travel to Cleveland and pick it up. But I did find my big box that says OPP, which stands for other people's pots. And so luckily I have like lots of, maybe not lots, but a nice collection of pots that are handmade. And that's the only thing I have. I have only one fork, I've realized, and 2 spoons, and a really nice set of pots and pans. But in my own work, I think there's some magic that is pottery's empty space on the inside. That it isn't complete until that space is filled. And I think that has to do with, nourishment. And so I had an epiphany about my work, which was that I was really interested in that empty space on the inside, but not for food, but actually for this conversation, or it's like the space in between all of us right now is that empty space. And we can put our thoughts and feelings into that space. And that's like food, So for me, that's kind of the magic, is that, the reason why I have a hard time not making vessel work is that I love that magic space in between the characters in my work. It's like they're all trapped on this piece, but they're on opposite sides, and they have this space in between them can be like, it could be like Fruit Loops, or it could be like, SpaghettiOs, or, pretzels, or filet mignon, but intellectually not like actual food. So that's what I think about.
That's great. You're living a very pared down COVID life, aren't you, with your one fork? I'm glad you have a few friends in your house from the pots surrounding you. Right,
yeah. I know, it's funny, if I make scrambled eggs, I have to wash my fork after scrambling the eggs, so I can actually it's kind of weird, but that's COVID life for you.
Thanks, Kevin. We'll keep it moving because we are over. How about Jessica? A similar question, and I'm curious to hear how food. Because you have some lovely salt cellars that I just wish I could put my hands on, because I imagine that they're really nestled kind of form.
They're weighted and banked, so the salt goes back in them really nicely. But I think so. I get high-minded about pottery, and then say, I am going to be a proper potter and try to force myself into spaces. And I've done that through a number of different projects. But I think what happened is, like Kevin's love and admiration of that hollow space, or that private space that pottery allows, I always fall back into that. And so it's a constant, like, trying to pull myself away from the, I'm going to spend a month on one object, because I just enjoy it. Like, there's something about it that pulls me in really deeply, and wanting to get back to something that has true function, like you're saying with the salt wells. And I think the core of staying within the clay particularly is you can really be a little, like in my case, I like humor, and I like kind of satirical humor, and particularly when it comes down to cups and mugs. And for me, that object, I could paint and draw all I like on a painting, but if I put the same thing on like a mug, it always turned into like a souvenir. And my orneriness always would state that, even if you don't like the way it looks, it's still functional. Don't look at it, just drink out of it. And there's something really, I guess, a little bit subversive about me as a maker, that everything is functional, yes, whether you're the maker or the user, but the novel experience has really become something I'm more interested in within the last couple years. And I think that's been largely inspired by having a big studio full of really active and engaged artists at the Archie Bray Foundation, like someone who can just like hemorrhage pottery that's both functional and beautiful, like a Stuart Gare, who is my neighbor, was always like busting my butt because I was still working on the same thing, and he had already created like 200 objects for 3 days. And so there's the banter in the people that you surround yourself with, but also the experiences with the objects. And like I would always say, if I needed inspiration, I would go shopping up and down the hallways of the studio, looking at how other people approach that and allowing it to kind of pollinate in my own world. So thanks, Stuart. That's the salt wells, by the way, Aysha. That banked rim, I was like, got it.
I can see that, absolutely.
My
Yeah, that's
turn.
good. Well, we need to have I think we need another thread on idea sourcing. I love the way that because we didn't really get to, this is going back to a question a while ago, the editing. Everybody, there was many of us talking about appropriating and taking, but there's something brilliant happening with the editing, which is putting out the work that we see on the screen when we click back to the sale, which is a beautiful interpretation of something that you've borrowed. So thanks, Jessica. So last but not least, we'll wrap up with the answer from Michael for this last question, and then we'll probably see Lisa again for a fade out. So Michael, I mean, I use your ramen bowl all the time. It's a favorite, and we need about 3 more because we fight over it.
Thank you. I'm embarrassed to say that I think that when I think I love food, obviously I eat food, but I'm very opinionated about the pots I use myself personally, but I feel like I've subverted the function of my pottery so deeply when I'm making it. I'm not sure if that's the right description, but I don't think about it so much when I'm making pots, but I'm always surprised when someone says, like yourself, like, I use that pot every day, or I use that bowl every day. It's like, I do hear that from time to time, and it always surprises me. Like, I'm not thinking about that so much when I'm working. I'm thinking more like, is this going to be, is this pattern going to work, or is this shape going to hold the pattern that I want to paint on it more? So it's funny that way. I do find that when I do use my own pots, I'm more critical of them when I'm using my own pots. But I think that there's such a wide spectrum of needs that people have when they're cooking, what they're eating, that I think that if I try to pinpoint that too much in my work, I think it would stifle me. So I like the flow of making pots. I like the flow of working on the wheel, and let that sort of be the space where I'm thinking while I'm making, not so much like, oh, this is going to be really great, because I'm looking at a piece that's kind of gray and wet, and slimy. It's hard to think. It's hard to project myself or project any food into that wet pot clay. But anyway, I do think I would like to. One thing I've noticed, I guess I'll say this and won't be enough from me, is that I've found that I've distilled my forms into some very simple, in a way, like cup, bowl, plate. Those are sort of my 3 plate pots that I make. I make pitchers, which I like to do, and sometimes jars, but I feel like I could really expand on the forms that I'm making when this is all over, and I feel more willing to take more risks in the studio. But thank you very much, by the way, for having me.
Thank you all. Oh, there's Lisa.
I'm back. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I know it's hard to wrap it up. We had many questions we would have loved to get to, but this has been a fantastic hour plus together. Big thank you, Jessica, Andrea, Michael, and Kevin. Thank you all for taking the time to be here with us today. Thank you, Aysha, Chris, and Bruce for leading us through this great conversation. Thank you all for being part of our sale this year and for supporting the art school at Old Church, and we will see you online.
Just one point really quick, Lisa, is that we still have 17 more questions.
Yeah. So this is going
here
until
all
8
night.
p.m.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
So fun.
It was
Thank
wonderful
you.
hearing
See your
from you all.
faces.
Nice to see
Take
you
care.
all.
Stay healthy.
More
Yeah,
work
everybody
for
stay
everybody.
safe.
Stay healthy.
Bye. Tomorrow at
Thank
10
you.
a.m. Yay. All right. Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Stay safe, everybody.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Oh, I miss
Thanks.